In 1961, Pontiac won 30 of 52 NASCAR races. That number alone would have been remarkable. What made it extraordinary was that Pontiac was not supposed to be racing at all. 4 years earlier, in 1957, the Automobile Manufacturers Association passed a resolution banning factory-backed racing. General Motors had not just signed it, they had pushed for it. And its chairman, Frederick Donner, enforced it like a legal requirement across every division. Every General Motors brand was out of racing. Officially. Pontiac didn't get the memo. By the end of the 1961 NASCAR season, Pontiac-powered cars had won more than half the races on the schedule. Engines developed inside Pontiac's engineering department, paid for with Pontiac money, running in cars operated by dealers who answered directly to Pontiac. The man who built the program was named Simon Knudsen, and he had been building it for 5 years before anyone on the 14th floor of the General Motors building thought to look. The question worth asking is a simple one. How does an engineer inside the second largest corporation on Earth build a racing engine so dominant that his own board eventually had to vote to kill it? Simon Knudsen was born in 1912 in Buffalo, New York. His father was William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who had run Ford's production lines under Henry Ford himself, and then ran all of General Motors during World War II. He was the man President Roosevelt personally called when he needed American factories converted to wartime manufacturing overnight. The name Knudsen carried weight inside Detroit that almost no other name did. Seaman went by Bunky. He had an engineering degree from MIT and an instinct for what made someone want a car rather than just need one. When GM sent him to Pontiac in 1956, the brand was 11 years into a slow, quiet decline. Silver streak styling strips, sensible sedans, the kind of car bought by people who had stopped caring what they drove. Pontiac had no performance identity, no racing program, and nothing that made a person under 40 give it a second look. Knudsen decided that was going to change. He brought in a young engine engineer named Malcolm McKellar, gave him a budget and a mandate, and told him to build the fastest production-based engines in America. McKellar did not need to be told twice. By 1959, the Pontiac 389 Tri-Power was available at the dealership counter. 3 two-barrel carburetors feeding a high-compression V8. Pontiac was winning races. The cars were selling. When Knudsen left for Chevrolet in 1961 and handed the division to Pete Estes, Estes understood the program well enough to protect it. McKellar kept building. What he produced in the early 1960s was the 421 Super Duty. The number referred to cubic inches, 421, slightly larger than Chevrolet's flagship V8 of the same era. But displacement only tells part of the story. McKellar built this engine with aluminum components wherever the rules allowed. It used a cast iron block, but an aluminum intake manifold, an aluminum front cover, and aluminum header-style exhaust manifolds that saved weight over conventional cast iron. The official horsepower rating was 405. The people who built it knew that number was a fiction. Real-world output was estimated closer to 465 horsepower before the racers started their own work on it. The compression ratio was 11-1. Street cars of the era typically ran 9.5-1. Running 11-1 required high-octane racing fuel. Pontiac's factory paperwork acknowledged this quietly and moved on. 2 4-barrel carburetors sat on top of a cross-ram intake manifold, a design where the carburetors mount diagonally across the engine's center line rather than sitting in line. At high RPM, the cross-ram improved airflow and added power in the upper range, where NASCAR qualifying laps were actually decided. This was not a street engine wearing racing clothes. It was a racing engine that happened to fit inside a production car. For NASCAR, McKellar's team went further. In 1962, Pontiac produced a version of the full-size Catalina that has since become one of the most unusual cars in American racing history. The engineers drilled 131 holes in the car's main frame rails. Not small holes, some of them 4 inches across, removing every pound of steel they could justify removing without the structure failing. The car became known as the Swiss cheese Catalina. In race trim, it weighed 3,450 pounds, meaningfully less than a standard Catalina, at a time when races were often decided by a car length over 500 miles. Approximately 16 of them were built. None were sold to the public. They went directly to race teams. The results were not subtle. At Daytona in 1962, Pontiac cars qualified at speeds the competition could not match. At Darlington, at Atlanta, Super Duty engines were pulling top-end numbers that made other crews walk over and question whether the dyno sheets were real. The cars were winning because the engine underneath them was genuinely better than anything else on the grid, and everyone at the track knew it. By mid-1962, everyone in Detroit knew what Pontiac was doing. Ford knew, Chrysler knew, the men on the 14th floor of the General Motors building knew. Donner had been told directly that one of his own divisions was openly defying the racing ban he had personally championed. Pontiac was not being quiet about it. Race wins generated press coverage. Press coverage meant Donner's counterparts at Ford could call him and ask, with perfect politeness, why General Motors' official position on factory racing did not seem to apply equally to everyone. Donner's position was becoming untenable. In January 1963, the General Motors Board of Directors issued a formal internal directive. It reached every division on the same day. The language was unambiguous in a way that previous orders had not been. All General Motors divisions were to cease all involvement in competitive motorsport immediately. No factory support, no engineering assistance, no parts availability for racing, no communication with race teams. The directive was Policy Guideline 20.5. It was not a suggestion. Pete Estes called his engineering staff together. The Super Duty program was finished. The parts inventory, the aluminum manifolds, the special cylinder heads, the cross-ram carburetors, the lightweight components that had taken 4 years and significant money to develop, was to be discontinued. Some of it was scrapped. Some was sold to dealers and racers at whatever they would pay, which was better than watching it destroyed. A small number of complete Super Duty engines made it into private hands before the window closed entirely. The 1963 Super Duty cars, Catalinas and Tempests, built specifically for a racing season that would now never happen for Pontiac, sat at the factory with nowhere to go, stranded. Some were disassembled. Others moved through dealers with the racing equipment stripped out. A handful reached buyers with the Super Duty hardware still installed, though Pontiac would not acknowledge any of it officially. The total production count for 1963 Super Duty cars is contested among historians. The number sits somewhere under 300 across all configurations. Most were stripped before delivery. The number of original, documented, unmodified examples that survive today is a fraction of that. At auction, legitimate cars routinely exceed $200,000. A fully documented Swiss cheese Catalina with traceable provenance has sold for considerably more. McKellar stayed at Pontiac. The Super Duty was dead. The knowledge wasn't. In 1964, Pontiac released the GTO. It was not a purpose-built racing car. It was a Tempest with a 389 cubic inch engine, the same engine McKellar's team had been developing and refining for years. That engine was placed in the engine bay by John DeLorean and a group of engineers who found a gap in GM's product approval process. The GTO didn't require board sign-off because it was technically an option package on an existing model, not a new car. By the time anyone on the 14th floor understood what had happened, the GTO was already in dealerships. It sold 32,450 units in its first year. It created an entirely new category of car that the American industry spent the next decade trying to replicate. The Chevelle SS, the Roadrunner, the Judge, the Dodge Challenger, every one of them exists because Pontiac's engineers needed somewhere to apply everything they had learned from building engines that GM's own board had voted to bury. Donner killed the Super Duty program in January 1963. He retired from GM in 1967. The GTO ran until 1974. The muscle car era it created defined American automotive culture for a generation. He didn't kill the engineers who built the engine. What they built next outlasted everything he ever put his name on. Anyway, that is that. YouTube thinks you will like this video, so click it. And if you stuck around this long, subscribe